Hi, welcome to Yale Daily News Multimedia and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Today we're joined by New York Times columnist and best-selling author David Brooks. Mr. Brooks, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
So I know you spoke to the Yale Daily News weekend print edition. We're going to cover some different topics, more policy related. And if it's okay, I want to jump right in.
Go ahead.
So we start with this big S word, sequester, on everybody's mind, this March 1st deadline. Many Republicans have accused Democrats of hyping up the consequences of the sequester. Governor Bobby Jindal, I think, said that the president was, quote, trying to scare the American people. How do you assess the sequester and its consequences?
Yeah.
Who's right? Are the Democrats overplaying this?
I think there's an element of truth on both sides. So first of all, it was designed to be stupid, and it succeeds magnificently in achieving that goal. So it was designed so you would never go over it. And so now we've got it. And on the one hand, you can say it's not that big a thing because we've had this tremendous ramp up in government spending over the last few years, from like 21% of GDP up to 24, 25. And agency after agency has seen increases of about 130%, 180% of their spending. And so this would cut spending by about 0.25% of GDP. And so on the one hand, as a percent of our total government, as a percent of our total economy, it's not that big a deal. But certain things are left out, such as entitlement programs, more or less. And so a lot of the spending gets focused on certain agencies. And so the National Institutes of Health, of concern to Yale, that really gets hit. And other things get hit. And so it's both true that it's not this devastating cut, especially given what's happened in the last few years, but there will be noticeable effects on defense, on health, on Head Start. And so there's localized serious cuts without any big massive cut.
Now, as you said, this was never supposed to happen. This was intended as an incentive, to get Congress to act, and obviously they're not doing it. Who is mostly to blame for this? Is this Senate Republicans, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, House Democrats, the president?
Yeah, I guess I'd put the blame maybe 60-40 Republican. Okay. And so let's start with the 40 that are Democratic. So I do think the Republicans just gave a lot on taxes. They just gave hundreds of billions of dollars in tax increases. I think given what happened a couple months ago, Republicans are legitimately worried that tax rates, which are now at 50% on the top incomes, if you keep hitting those same people again and again, they're paying effective rates of 60% of their income is going off in taxes. I really do think you begin to distort their behavior. And so I'm a little wary of having another round of tax increases just imposed on the top 1%. So, I think the president's demand to do that, I think it's disproportionate. The Republican side, the president has made some offers on cutting Social Security spending, Medicare spending, other spending, and they've been unwilling to give anything. And so I don't think it's a 50-50. I don't think it's 100-0. I'd put 60-40.
Now, this is like Groundhog Day, Capitol Hill version. I mean, it keeps happening again and again, and when Chris Dodd was at Yale to speak last year, he talked about how, people just don't get lunch anymore. As trivial as that sounds, how much of this partisan gridlock is based on just a lack of substantive relationships that, once were there?
Yeah, I think that's an element. I would phrase it differently. They don't get drunk anymore. So Chris Dodd doesn't want to say this, but they used to get drunk together at night. They used to live together. It used to be when I was meeting a member of Congress, my chit-chat, small talk was, so does your family live here or back home? But I no longer say that anymore because they all live back home. And so then none of them bring their families. So they don't socialize. The wives are not here. The husbands, the spouses are not here. And so they don't have dinner parties. And so there is a genuine lack of socialization across party lines. And so I think that's an element. I don't think it's the major element. I think the policy makers are responding rationally to incentives. The country essentially wants low taxes and high spending, and they're giving it to them. And the problem is the country's demands are incoherent. And so I think if I blame people, I do sort of blame the president for not explaining to the American people what the fiscal situation is, not just giving a speech with a bunch of charts, laying it out. And then two, I sort of blame him for not getting us in a different frame. We were in this same, as you say, Groundhog Day of budget fights. But the president gets to choose how we're going to fight, what the frame of debate is going to be. And if he shifted the frame away from the same big government, small government debate we've been having, I think that would be a constructive thing to do.
Well, that leads right into my next question, which is, during these budget fights, it seems like Joe Biden has been, the president's biggest asset because people like him. And I know you've spoken in the past about how even Democrats, and not just Republicans, but Democrats in his own party don't want to negotiate with the president because he thinks they're, quote, political hacks.
Right.
Is this a failure of leadership on the president's part?
I think the aloofness has pros and cons, and the con is that he doesn't have genuine trust among even Democrats, let alone Republicans. I think he'd be well served to meet not only, he meets with John Boehner periodically, but to actually get to know some of the other people in the Republican caucus, a guy named Dave Camp, who's chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And then, he just is not a super social guy with the House Democrats. So I think much more than he does, I guess, that personal relationships really matter in business and in policy making, and that would help ease the way. So in the case of Biden, I nonetheless think it's fair that while Biden has the personal relationships, so they like working with him, it's not like he's a freelancer. He's doing what the president tells him to do. So it's mostly Obama working through Biden. But I wish the president would spend a little more time just on sheer personal content.
Now, you've known President Obama a long time, even before 2009, before he was inaugurated. I want to give you a quote from Abraham Lincoln, just because Lincoln's been in the news lately with Spielberg's movie. He said, "Any man can stand adversity, but if you want to test his character, give him power." How has power changed President Obama from his earliest days as senator all the way up to now? What has he learned, and how has it affected his character?
Yeah. The self-confidence was always there from whenever he first burst on the scene in 2004. So it hasn't changed him that way. He still is an extremely self-confident person. I think the thing that's changed him is I think he then had a sense that he could transcend the debates, and now he feels he's just stuck in them. So he's become a much more bloody-minded person, much less idealistic, much tougher, much grumpier, because he thinks the world is he's surrounded by stupidity. And so I think there's been a deterioration in the level of his just general happiness as he's stuck in this world. At the same time, I think he feels more at ease in commanding the offices of the presidency. He knows how it works a little better, and he knows foreign policy a lot better. He feels more confident overruling generals and things like that. So I think he's
that wasn't the case before Afghanistan.
Right. He was more deferential, and now I think he's more confident in asserting his authority. At the same time, I think he's a little less idealistic and inspiring in the way he views the world.
Now, you talked about self-confidence. You're teaching a seminar at Yale called Humility. Do you think today's political environment even allows for any humble political leaders?
It certainly discourages them. Partly, Lincoln was genuinely humble, and I think Eisenhower I hold up as someone who was humble. He was very self-confident, but he also knew the limits of his own abilities, and he knew the limits of the power of government. And if you compare his farewell address in 1961 to John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, which happened 3 days later, Eisenhower's speech is about balance, it's about limits, it's about suspicion of concentrated power. Kennedy's address is about how we can eradicate disease, conquer cancer, end starvation. It's total utopianism. And so, even though they're both extremely self-confident people, I think Eisenhower comes from a different moral culture. That's more or less what the course is about. It's hard to campaign for office when you're talking about yourself the whole time and remain humble, or become president where you're surrounded by thousands of people who love you every day. It's a test of character.
Now, you speak about Eisenhower. The president's speechwriters I was reading were looking at Eisenhower kind of as a model when they were writing the inauguration. Right. What can the president take from President Eisenhower's second term and use in his own second term?
Yeah, well, I think the foreign policy is reasonably well aligned. I think Eisenhower had a deep suspicion of trying to use military power in insurgent wars and in small ways. So that sense of realism is there. The difference between Obama and Eisenhower is that Eisenhower had a great suspicion of technocratic leaders, the idea that smart people could sit around a table in Washington and plan the country. I think the people in the Obama administration are much more likely to think they can do that. And so I would counsel a little more Eisenhower on domestic policy.
David Brooks, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. This is YDN Multimedia. Everybody has a story. See you next time.